Okay, I think it's working. Yep.
Great.
Okay, I just had to reset the key for some reason. Yeah, okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. and sorry for the delay. I had some issues with with YouTube. Anyway, so it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome Nicolas today. And particularly, I'd like to thank him for waking up so early. He's on the West Coast, so it's 7 a.m. for him, if I'm not mistaken. So he's, for those of you who might not know, Nicolas is a research scientist at Google Brain. He's done tons of really great work at the intersection of machine learning and security and privacy. And he has a PhD from Berkeley. And well, what else? I think the floor is yours. Nicolas, thanks again. We'll start the recording just as a backup to the live streaming now. And if you have any questions, I think Nicolas is happy to take questions, also during the talk, not just at the end. But for those of you who are watching the live stream, please type the questions in the chat. And since there is a delay, we'll ask those questions during, sort of a natural break in the flow of the presentation. Thanks a lot, Nicolas. Take it away. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I guess to start, yeah, happy to take questions at any point during this. Sometimes when I give talks, I like to sort of cover a lot of different little things in sort of a superficial level, and that can be helpful to see sort of a survey of an area, but this time I'm going to do something a little different and spend almost all my time talking about just one result, which is a paper that we wrote recently called Extracting Training Data from Large Language Models. So more than happy to pause at any time if you have a question that would otherwise seem trivial or something that like is sort of, oh, I don't want to bother about this little thing. The entire hour is going to be spent on this one paper. And so I'm happy to spend as much time as people want on any aspect of this. So let's sort of get started with, I guess I should mention, in case it wasn't clear, this was a paper that took a lot of people to write. All of them deserve a lot of the credit as well for doing this. It was not easy to get this many people together to sort of write one paper, but I'm glad that everyone was available because everyone else really helped make this happen. So the general setup here is that we're using machine learning more and more in many of these privacy settings where here's an example of deep learning being used for cancer detection. And the way these work is you train a model on a bunch of people's medical images. And as a result, you hope that it could be useful for some individual people. And so you might send them the model so they could run it on their own images. But if it was possible to take the model and pull out of it individual people's medical scans, that would be bad. And so we really need to be concerned with the privacy of the models in this way, where the model itself might be released to everyone, but we want to make sure that the data it was trained on remains private. And this is true, also for text messages, where we have people training models on text messages to predict the next words that you might type, or training models on email messages to sort of complete the rest of your email to make it so you can save typing a few characters in email messages. And again, these models are trained on everyone's text messages and everyone's emails to make your text messages and emails easier to write. And so if it was possible to extract their email messages or their text messages by querying this model, that would be a problem. And so this is sort of very nicely summarized by this XKCD from a couple of years ago, where you have this person typing at the computer saying, "Long live the revolution, our next meeting will be at." And then as if you have the Gmail Smart Compose completing, the docs at midnight on June 28th. And the person at the computer saying, aha, I found them. And the caption is very nice. It says, when you train predictive models on inputs from your users, it can leak information in unexpected ways. And so if you were at Usenix a couple of years ago, sort of everything that I've said up until now is identical to a talk that I was giving then. And so the question is like, why am I talking about this now? Like, what is it that's different between now and a couple of years ago? And the question we had this time is like, is this actually something real? So lots of privacy analysis is done, but most privacy analysis that people do in the research space is focused on language models or other models that the researchers have trained themselves in order to study the privacy of that model in particular, which is fine. This is good. It especially makes it easy to do rigorous science that tries to answer like, does doing X help privacy? Because now you can sort of compare X to not X and actually do rigorous science here. The problem is that it's not actually clear to what extent it's a problem in practice if you do like all of the best things and you're one of the best people in the world who knows how to train language models. It's not clear if these models actually have a problem in the first place. Because despite like all of the known potential problems, no one's actually demonstrated like some real problem with an actual big model before. And so that was what we wanted to do. We wanted to actually try and attack a real big model and just see how good of an attack we could get. Okay, so let me start with what we're actually able to do, and then I'll go into a bunch of data analysis, and then I'll have some conclusions. So how do you extract text from a language model? Basically, it's two simple steps. First, you generate a lot of data, and then you predict membership inference on that data. And so what I'm going to do for the next couple minutes is walk through sort of what it means to generate data from a language model, and then what it means to do predicting membership inference. So a language model, if you're not familiar, is just a probabilistic sequence over words generally. So we have this sample from GPT-2 a couple of years ago, which where someone has prompted the model, has given the model the initial thing that was sort of written by a human. It says like, in a shocking finding, scientists discovered a herd of unicorns, and then gave a little bit more context. And then the model, which was written by GPT-2, responded like, the scientists named the population after the distinctive horn, and sort of it like is coherent and explains like that these unicorns live in South America, which is sort of correct, and they're able to speak, and sort of it's really good in taking the context into account. It's not just good at like generating reasonably looking like English. It's actually quite a good model. Okay, so this is what a language model does. It generates lots of text. It was trained on lots of data in order to do this. So this GPT-2 model, for example, was trained on 40 gigabytes from the internet of who knows what, and hopefully it's learned to do good quality text like this, and hopefully it hasn't learned to just memorize what people say on the internet. Okay, so I'm going to be treating, for the most part, language models kind of like a black box, where you just give it a random prompt. So I say like, this is a random input, and the language model just more or less tells me what the output should be. There is a lot of work on how language models actually work. None of that is important for this talk, so I'm going to ignore it. It doesn't matter if we're using a transformer or an RNN or an LSTM or whatever you want. The results are essentially the same as long as you have a good language model. We'll pick a representative example, GPT-2, and work with that. Everyone today uses transformers, but I don't expect things to be different if tomorrow someone else came out with a better architecture. So you can do this, and if you put in like random prompts, the model still works. Like, there's no reason you have to ask the model what it thinks of natural text. You can put in whatever you want, and the model will still try and give you some coherent output. Sometimes it just decides that what you said doesn't make sense, just ends the sentence and sort of goes on to some other topic because that's the best it knows how to do. Okay, so basically the way our attack works is we just use this to prompt the model a lot and just get lots and lots and lots of text. And now in practice, we do this, so we get something like 600,000 possible outputs from the model. And then we run what's called a membership inference attack to just pick out the ones that are memorized and say like, this text here is text that's likely drawn from the training data and not something the model came up with by itself. And so like at a 2 or 3 minute level, this is what our attack is trying to do. Happy to pause now and just see if there are any questions on the setup or just this sort of brief overview of what we're trying to do. Okay, if there are questions later, please do feel free to interrupt me. There should be more than enough time.
Sorry, I have one.
Great.
Yeah, so here you mentioned membership inference attacks. So are you comparing here the distribution of test set, and training set?
Yeah, I'll get to that in just a second. Okay. Yeah, so I actually probably lied. I think I'll get to that in like 3 minutes because I'm going to explain a little bit about how do we generate the samples from the model first, and then I'll answer your question on membership inference. So, okay, so like what do we actually do to get samples from a model? Because we want to get a lot of different samples. Like how do you make the model not give you the same thing every time? So what a model actually does is you give it some input where you say like, the input to the model is this is. And then what the model will do is it's going to give us a probability distribution over all possible sequences of words that could come next. And so maybe the next most likely word is A with 42% probability. And then you could have this is something with 9% probability, or this is what with 4% probability. And then like way down at the bottom, like the least likely thing that could come out of the model is maybe the word is, because this isn't a valid sentence. And so then what we do is you sort of just pick one of these, sort of you sample according to this distribution. Maybe we sample A this time, and you repeat the process. You say, this is A. And then you ask the model, what comes next? And again, you have probability distribution over words. And this time, maybe we sample this. We end up sampling banana. It's only 6% likely, but 6% happens some of the time. And so then we have, this is a banana. And then we ask the model what comes next. And then maybe we decide the output is, this time going to be this end of sequence token, which is a special token, which means like I'm done generating the output, nothing more from here. So we do that. And now we're sort of done and we have the sentence, this is a banana. Okay. So in the paper, we consider 3 different ways to generate text. The first way we consider is exactly what I just told you, where you just sample according to the probability distribution. The second way is you do the same thing, but you sort of add a little bit more sampling randomness so that instead of sampling exactly according to the distribution here, you sample according to this distribution but made a little bit more noisy. And the reason you might want to do this is so that the model gives you a more diverse set of outputs, so that instead of just giving exactly sort of fairly bland text every time, because you might, the model might be sort of too cautious in what it generates, you sort of add a little bit more randomness to the sampling process so it gives you more broad output space. And the final thing we consider is generating text where this prompt, this initial sequence we give it, isn't just sort of the empty string, which is what we considered for the other two, but is a couple words just randomly chosen from some text on the internet. Again, here in order to hopefully increase diversity, where we want the model to be able to spit out things that are maybe starting from some rare other prompt. Yeah, okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to generate, using these 3 techniques, we generate 200,000 samples under each of these 3 techniques. And so now what I need to tell you how we do is how we actually do this membership inference thing. Okay, so membership inference is a very well-studied kind of attacks. It was initially shown in machine learning models in 2017. And the idea is fairly straightforward. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my model, and I'm going to look at the probability of each word occurring given all the prior text. So I sort of just take all these numbers, I just multiply them down across, and I end up with something saying like the probability of this sentence like occurring is 1e minus 5. It actually turns out to be almost exactly 1e minus 5. And the idea of membership inference attacks, if you're familiar with them, for example, on images, is basically what the question asks, is does the example have high likelihood? And if it's yes, then you say memorized. If it's no, you say not memorized. And it turns out for images, this actually works quite well. It's sort of surprising, but the idea is if you train on something, during training time, you're explicitly asking the model to do better on this than you would otherwise expect. And so the models do better on their training data than on their non-training data. And so higher confidence corresponds to higher likelihood in being a member. Okay, so this is what you do sort of in standard image tasks. The question is, what do we actually do here? Because the problem is that perplexity, which is basically essentially this measure of multiply the probabilities individually. There's a log thrown in there for numerical stability, but for now, for this talk, I'm just going to show you these actual probabilities. The problem is that imagine the model said the probability of this first thing, this is a banana, is 1e minus 5. And imagine the model also said the probability of this random sequence of numbers, which is a sequence of numbers actually the model actually memorized, is 1e minus 5. Sort of intuitively, the second one actually is much more obviously some training data. And the reason why is because any model should have been able to generate the first one with reasonably low or with reasonably high probability, reasonably low perplexity. But the fact that the second string, the fact that this string also has high probability, low perplexity, is somehow surprising, because you wouldn't have expected that it would know these random numbers and be so happy generating these random numbers. And so what we do is a fairly simple trick where we take two models. We have F1, which is the model that we care about, and then F2, which is some other model which was trained in a different way. Maybe this is a smaller version of the same model. Maybe this is, just a text compression library that just gives you a really basic understanding of how likely it is to be memorized. Maybe it doesn't really matter. Just some other model trained some other way, and we compare the likelihood ratio of these two models. And if the two models are sort of equally confident in these examples, then we say, well, probably what's the case is that this is just good quality text. And the ratio is roughly 1, everything is fine. On the other hand, if one model really, really likes this text, and another model says that's sort of really crazy, I just don't even know sort of how you could come up with this and why you think that's likely, then we consider this to be much more likely to be memorized. And so this is what we're going to do for our membership inference attack. Instead of just saying the likelihood of an example by itself, we're going to consider the ratio of the likelihoods of an example and some other model, which we've chosen in a number of different ways. Okay, so to summarize briefly then, we're going to extract training data by generating a lot of data using one of 3 different techniques that all sample according to some probability distribution. And then for each of those, we're going to just check and try and guess if it was a member of the training data set or not. Notice that there is almost certainly going to be stronger attacks than what we're doing here, because we're sort of splitting this attack into 2 discrete steps. There likely is a better attack that sort of at the same time of generation also tries to make it stumble upon things that are more likely to be memorized. But we're not doing that right now. We're just going to look at the simplest possible thing, which has this nice side effect of showing that even if for language modeling, you're not worried about an actual adversary trying to sort of exploit the model, you're just going to use this thing. This is going to give you a bound on how likely it is to just randomly, just for no good reason, just start spitting out memorized content. Okay, let me pause again and sort of take questions on the setup of how we're going to generate this stuff.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for the F1 and F2 models, they are different, but are you assuming that they are trained on different data sets?
Not necessarily. So concretely, one thing we do is we look at F1, which is this GPT-2 XL, which is 1.5 billion parameter GPT-2 model, and we consider F2 as GPT-2 small, which is same data set but 100 million parameter model. Where the idea is this model is 10 times smaller, probably it's memorized less, and so maybe that helps. We also consider just like compressing with zlib, which was trained on no data. and just as a generally good quality of finding just duplicated content. Okay, I don't see any other questions on the chat.
Hi, I had a quick question too.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you like you only need the probabilities, or do you also need like a ranking, or do you need like more than one? Because normally, like, I'm not sure how GPT does it, but normally they either do like a beam search or they do a sampling, or, you know, how much access did you have and how much access do people normally have when they do
Yeah, it's a good
these
question.
things?
So what we assume is that we have access to so we only need access to the perplexity of the generated sequence. So I need to know for each sequence how likely the model is to think that that sequence is like good quality text. And you could probably do better if you had more access than this. In practice, when we actually have GPT-2, which is the model we attack, we have like the full model. And so we could like study whatever we wanted about it, which is another way our attack is limiting, is we could like look at the attention matrix and do something confusing there. And we didn't do this. We just looked at the output, again, just to try and come up with the simplest possible attack as a first demonstration of this.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now that I've described sort of what the attack is going to do, let's talk about the numbers. Like, how well does this work? And for that, yeah, we're going to attack this GPT-2 model. And so the reason why we're going to pick this model is the sort of three nice reasons why GPT-2 is sort of the perfect target. The first is that at least when it was released and we were doing this work, it was the state-of-the-art language model that was sort of undisputed. It's sort of one of the first models where people really started thinking seriously about what it would mean to have a model which can generate text almost as good as a human. Because a lot of the text that it spits out is just really good. And so because of this, there's no concern that like we as researchers like accidentally did something to like subvert the model to make it memorize more than it otherwise would have. Like, this is sort of at the time the best model that anyone could hope for. The other reason why it's nice to attack this model is that it's public. Anyone can download the weights and do whatever they want with it. And so it's not the case that we're the only ones who could have done this. Like, if there's a problem with it, someone else is eventually going to find it. And so, you know, in the standard responsible disclosure kind of thing, might as well study this now before someone else finds serious problems later. And then the third reason is that all of the data that GPT-2 was trained on was data scraped from the internet. And so the data that was originally originated like in the public. But despite that, OpenAI never actually released the training data set itself. And so the data set is still private. And so what this means is that it's not possible for us to like accidentally cheat in some way by accidentally using more information than we should have access to, because we just don't have access to the data set. But despite that, if we were to succeed and we were to attack this model and pull something out of it, the best we could hope for is to pull something out of the model that was already public. And so hopefully this sort of mitigates several of the ethical concerns that we might have from trying to extract private information from a model, because at least we know the data was already public at one point. Now, there's still reasons to maybe be concerned. Maybe the people didn't intend for the information to be on the internet, it just happened to be. Maybe the information was intended, but then was removed. Maybe the information was intended to be used in one context, contact information for some project, and now we're just sort of pulling it out, not related to that project, and maybe they're concerned. So there still are valid other concerns, but at least we try and mitigate as many of them as possible by making sure that the information, like anyone could find this by doing it by attacking this public model, and the data already was public when it was trained. Okay, so this is why you picked GPT-2. So concretely, what we're going to do, and this is one of the figures from the paper, is we're going to prompt the model as I showed you earlier. We're going to generate a couple of 100,000 outputs. We're going to sort them according to these membership inference likelihood ratios. And then we're going to sort of deduplicate, because it turns out models like to spit out the same things a bunch. So we just drop all of the examples that are repeated. And then we're going to look at sort of, according to this membership inference function, we're going to look at some of the top 100 outputs from what, according to what's likely to be memorized. It's not actually the top 100. Like among the top 1,000 samples, we choose 100 of them so that we don't just only sample near the tail, but a distribution, but essentially this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to check for each of these samples if it's memorized. And we do this sort of manually. We sort of search the internet to see if we can find this thing occurring. And we only say yes if we can find like a fairly long and unique substring that like we just think like is exceedingly unlikely for the model to have generated by itself. So this is like random numbers or like lots of other things that like we're reasonably confident are have to be training data. And then independently, we confirm with the OpenAI GPT-2 authors that we were correct, and we were, but we wanted to also show that someone can do this kind of attack without having access to the training data and can check like with sort of human intuition to know which of these examples were not memorized. And this can also be done. So among the examples that we search for, again, because we're looking at 3 metrics and 6 different ways of doing it, there are possible 1,800 memorized things we could find. So like the upper bound of what we could hope to find is 1,800 examples. We find roughly 600 memorized of those are memorized, so roughly a third. And again, we're sampling up at the high end of the tail, so it's not a third of the outputs of GPT-2 are memorized, but a third of the things that we think might be memorized actually are. And so what we find is sort of this is the high-level result of the kinds of things that we're able to extract out of the model. A lot of this is interesting, but not necessarily all that concerning. We find a lot of news where we can pull out of the model like sentences of news articles that just are public, and you just sort of, they're on the internet now, and the model just likes to remember these things for some reason. Lots of log files or error messages, misconfigured web servers, these kinds of things that happen. Lots of licenses, MIT license, GPL, these kinds of things. For some reason, lots of forums have like this like repeated text that says like, oh, you're looking at the something forum, and we can figure out this a bunch of times. And there are a bunch of other things, but maybe 2 of the ones that are most interesting are we have 46 examples of individual named people, but like not mentioned in the context of news. That like is some person who has their information, their name on the internet, and we're able to extract their name out, but it's not like in the context of some news article. And then we have 32 examples of contact information for people, which is some way of getting in contact with them, which might not be like completely obvious. Now, for most people, if you search hard enough, you can find their contact information on the internet. But like the fact that the model happened to remember 32 of these people's contact information, we thought was somewhat surprising. And there are lots of other things that we can find. We sort of cut the tail off at 10 here, but sort of there's a very diverse range of things that we can get out of the model. Okay, so one of the things I think is interesting is we can get out of the model a lot of random like number sequences. Where like this is something surprising. Like not only does the model memorize sort of these like good quality, like natural, I don't know, news articles or whatever, but we can also get it like these just completely random number sequences that are between, in this case, 10 and 87 characters long. And interestingly, for all of these number sequences, they were contained in exactly one training document. We only know this because we asked the OpenAI authors to count for us. And they could tell us like each of these occurred in exactly one web page on the internet. And on that web page, it was repeated sometime between 10 and 300 times. And so this is interesting that like we have sort of roughly how many times things need to be inserted before it's memorized. And apparently in this one case, something is repeated 10 times, and that's enough for it to be memorized all the way up until 300 times. But I think it's also interesting is that you can have something that only appears on one web page ever, but if it appears many times on that web page, this also can mean that that the model is going to memorize it, which means that you also not only have to be concerned with like, lots of people talking about a thing, but one person talking about a thing several times, which in the privacy setting maybe is a little more interesting to think about. Okay, let me do one more slide and then I'll take a few questions. So this is a breakdown of how much memorization we find according to each of the different ways of generating text and each of the different ways of detecting generated text. So on the columns are the generation strategies. This is step 1. And on the rows are the membership of inference strategies, and this is step 2. So perplexity is the standard thing that, like I just told you, you sort of look at the likelihood of the model, and if it's high, you say member. If it's low, you say non-member. We just sort according to the perplexity and look at the top couple hundred. Small and medium here mean compare the likelihood ratio between the model that we're using, which is this GPT-2 XL, this is their best model, and the small and the medium variance. Fewer parameters, and so likely to memorize less stuff. We also compare against something, against zlib, where this literally means take the text, compress it with zlib, and compute the length of the text. And the idea here is if you have something like the model saying like A, which sometimes models do, they just sort of fail. Zlib compression is going to say like, this is garbage. I can easily deduplicate this. And so the likelihood ratio is going to be pretty low. We also compare with two other things called window and lowercase. They're slightly more confusing, but window just looks at perplexity over sliding windows, because you might have a model where some small piece of it is memorized, but of the text is memorized, but not all of it. And we also have something called lowercase, which compares the ratio between the text and the lowercase version of the text, which is going to hopefully find things that are abnormal because of how they are capitalized or something. And then, yeah, again, on the columns, we have top N, which is the standard sampling strategy I told you earlier. We have temperature, which is what people call it when you increase the likelihood of sampling from the tails when you sample from the model. And then we have internet, which is like the prompting from things on the internet. And so what you can find is some combinations of this work very, very poorly. So if you're doing this temperature sampling, then you shouldn't look at the perplexity, because if you do, then like only 3 of 100 samples are memorized. And so like this looks quite bad. But if you're looking at temperature and you compare to like GPT-2 small or to zlib, like this works quite well, and half of the things you find are memorized. The best possible way we have to sample from the model, it turns out not to be temperature. That actually is quite bad, which was a surprise to us. We thought it would be a little better. But was just doing standard generation, but just prompting with a couple of words from the internet. And the reason why is it turns out that models just don't have very diverse outputs. And if you prompt from the internet, then this helps increase the diversity. So you find sort of more sets of things. And then the best possible inference strategy, again, it turns out perplexity does quite poorly. And comparing to these other models, all doesn't do identically, but it does quite well. And it turns out if you like take the union of things that are found with GPT-2 medium and with the union of memorized content that's found with GPT-2 medium and that's found with zlib, that covers roughly 80% of what's found by everything else as well. So the types of things that these find are quite similar examples. I saw there were 2 questions that I'll take, I think. Maybe not. Okay, I thought I saw some questions, but I guess not. Okay, so let me pause now and see if there are any questions anyone wants to ask. Okay, I'll keep going and feel free to stop me if you have questions. Okay, so the other thing that we can do, which I think is sort of my favorite experiment in the paper, is we find a single training document, like we find a document on the internet that we suspect was contained in the training data set. And we actually confirmed with the GPT-2 authors that it was. And this document is really nice because we know it's in the training data, and it has a bunch of URLs in it, where the URLs are repeated between 8 and 359 times. And so this is sort of like a perfect sort of natural case study to try and figure out what you need to do for something to be memorized. So what we find is, so we can sort of have, I have each of the documents listed on a row. I have the number of times it was inserted in this one document. And then I have this column of memorized. And this is the question memorized here is, were we able to extract this string from the model? And the way we do this is we prompt it with the beginning of the URL. These were all Reddit URLs. So we prompt it with reddit.com. And we say, what comes next? And we do this like 10,000 times. And if the output of any of these generations is this sequence, we say, yes, it's memorized. And so it turns out that for all of these top ones, if it's inserted more than 33 times, then GPT-2 XL, which is the largest version, the 1.5 billion version of GPT-2, can regurgitate exactly this URL. And interestingly, like this URL actually has like this 6-character random number sequence also. So we can pull it out of the model, and like it's quite good at memorizing these URLs. And so, okay, so this is interesting because it tells us, like, in the other example, we had some random numbers coming out that were inserted 10 times. Here it looks like 33. So like, you know, low single-digit numbers is how many times something needs to be inserted before it's memorized. But now, because like we know that these things were training data, we can ask a similar question and say, like, well, what if we tried the same thing with GPT-2 medium? This model is medium size, which in this case means 300 million parameters, which is still like, this is a lot of parameters. Like 5 years ago, this would be crazy big. But now is sort of still okay with, I mean, it's 3 times smaller, or maybe 5 times smaller. And we find it memorizes less. It memorizes things that are inserted 56 times and above, and not consistently. And then we get the same thing for GPT-2 small, which is small at only 100 million parameters. And this one memorizes none of these strings. And so this is kind of very interesting, because it means that even in these large scales, adding more parameters really does make a big difference for memorization. And so we do one more thing that we look at. So this was what happens if we sort of prompt with reddit.com and ask it to just one-shot complete the entire rest of the string. We do sort of this halfway thing to like make it a little easier for the model. I'm not going to describe exactly what we do. But we sort of do this additional beam search kind of to make it a little easier for it to generate high likelihood tokens. And we find that we can like make this sort of halfway attack. It's still a valid attack, but it's a little more sophisticated, work only in the smallest setting for this 359 times inserted document. And for the medium model, a couple more times. And so again, I mean, the observation here is that we have these models that are all quite big. The biggest model is a lot bigger than the smallest of these, and it has a lot more memorization. And so I guess the reason why this is interesting is like if we like consider model sizes over time, like in 2018, the biggest model was BERT. And this is like, you know, BERT was like maybe 100 million parameters. GPT-2 XL, which is the one we consider in this paper, it was like sort of 10 times bigger at like 1.5 billion parameters. Things have gotten a lot bigger since then. Later that year, T5 came out of Google, which was another factor of 10 bigger. It was like 11 billion parameters. And then last year, GPT-3 came out, which is another 10 times bigger, and is like 100 billion parameters. I think actually now there are trillion parameter models. And like, so we have gone up another factor of 10. So like we're like year over year, 10 times bigger each time. And if you sort of look back at this plot, the thing I find interesting is the difference between XL and small is roughly a factor of 10. And the number of times something has to be inserted in the training data for it to memorize it is roughly a factor of 10. So we have models that are 10 times, from small to XL is 10 times bigger model, and from small to XL is 359 insertions to 33. And so you could conjecture that maybe GPT-2, GPT-3 or something like it will memorize things that are inserted just 3 times in the training data set. And you might be able to argue that if you say something 33 times, the model should memorize it. 3 is sort of pushing the limit, where like I probably wouldn't even expect that a model would memorize it if I say it just a couple times. And so this is sort of the real concern, is that as these models get bigger, they're going to do this more and more, and we'll have to sort of figure out some way of handling this. So let me pause now and see if there are any questions on these kinds of results.
I guess if nobody's asking, let me ask a question. Hello, Nicholas.
Yes.
Hi. So I guess you mentioned that it's not surprising if you see it 350 times inside, but it's surprising when it's once. So what do you think is the reason why it memorizes it for once? Is this data inductive bias? Is this operator bias? Or where is this actually coming from?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think the short answer is I don't know. We don't find any examples of things that we memorized that are only inserted once yet. It's a very interesting question to ask. So you should take this one experiment with a grain of salt, because this is what happens for Reddit URLs. Like, this is how many times Reddit URLs have to be inserted for them to be memorized, which might be very different than how many times something else has to be inserted before it's memorized. In sort of other synthetic experiments, we've generally found that it's easier for models to memorize things that are more out of distribution. And this sort of is a little counter to the fact that models memorize things because of inductive biases or something. But I don't know that we have something that I feel confident in saying is correct. I can give you a wild speculation, which is this: that suppose that you have a model and the parameters have to be some subset of the parameters have to be set up in some way in order for the model to do well. But there are a lot of parameters in the model that the model has lots of parameters, so it can pick some subset of them and just say, like, these parameters, your job is just to memorize the things that occur most likely, just to give the model, make the model have high score. And it's easy to separate out, to make those parameters do their job, to spit out memorize the random things on things that are further away from the distribution than it is for things that are in distribution. I have absolutely zero evidence for this fact. But empirically, it does seem to be the case that models will sort of memorize random things easier than non-random things. And so we see this here too. I think, so I have this slide a couple of slides ago, where here's an example of the model memorizing something that's like an 87 character random string or 40 character random string inserted just 10 and 22 times. And the model's more than happy to memorize this. But if you go here, we have this case where we need 33 insertions of a fairly sort of natural kind of ish English text. So we need more, and it's more in distribution. And so, yeah, so this is what we find, but this is a nice question. I don't think I have a good answer for it.
Yeah, perhaps then the answer to this becomes somebody should ask OpenAI for the data set and try to see whether there is some higher order statistic where subsequences appear or something.
Yes. Yeah, so we're doing a project right now where we're training some large models on data sets that are public in order to try and answer some of these questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So I have another question. One thing that people normally say, when you show them these types of results, especially text people, NLP people, it's that, well, if you deduplicate the data well, and if you scrub it well, then none of these happen. And they kind of just they're this is not a real problem, and if you have your normal data doesn't get memorized like this. So I kind of I understand the answer that it's well, it is happening now, and there's no really good scrubbing mechanism, so this is something that we should be concerned with. But what is your answer to this?
Yeah. No, okay. Right. So this is a good, this is part of the reason why I wanted to run this on sort of one of the state-of-the-art models. Because it's always possible to say, well, if only they had done something better, then this wouldn't have happened. And like the people who trained this model were the best people and the researchers in the world at training big models. And this is the model that they trained. And if they could have done something that would have made it significantly better, they probably would have done it. And so empirically, they did not deduplicate their training data in this way. I mean, so I should say they like this model, and so T5 also, which is another large language model, do deduplicate their training data sets. Like they just don't deduplicate them like enough, because like you have to deduplicate it like at the like words level or something. Like it'd be very difficult. We're actually hopefully there'll be, if like you wait maybe 3 weeks or something, we have a paper on deduplicating training data sets that will be coming out. But yeah, it's remarkably hard to deduplicate training data sets. And this is why most training data sets aren't. Like they're deduplicated at a coarse level, but like at a fine-grained level where like you have one document which has something where in this document many things occurs many times. Like this, you need to do this. And you have to be careful because some things are duplicated many times, and it's good that they're duplicated many times. Like if I deduplicated at the word level and just made every word in the English language occur exactly once in my document, this would be terrible. Like it would be like I would destroy all utility. So like I have to like keep some kinds of like duplicates in. So like where you draw the threshold is semi-arbitrary, and it's difficult. But yeah, this is right. Oh yeah, okay. Maybe this is sort of a great transition to the next part, which is to talk about defenses. Right. So what do we do? So this is the last part of the talk, so like differential privacy is a thing that people have recommended in the past. This is from a previous paper that I wrote on language model privacy, where we said that by using differential privacy, we can eliminate memorization. And this is true, it's sort of in principle. If you have something inserted in the training data once, then differential privacy will make it so you can't memorize the tails of the distribution. Problem is that these things are not inserted once, right? These things are inserted between like 10 and 300 times. In this case, they're all inserted in one document, but there are lots of things that are inserted in many documents. And so it's not even clear sort of what differential privacy would mean. Like how would you aggregate over differential privacy in order to capture this kind of memorization to make it so it doesn't happen? Because like the guarantees scale like exponentially poorly with the number of times that something is inserted. So you have something inserted once, maybe the guarantee holds. You have something inserted 10 times and the guarantee just is completely vacuous. And so, yeah, so differential privacy, like great in principle, but for text data sets of things that like could be overlapping, it's hard to really capture exactly what we mean if we want to say something formal here. Okay, so maybe let's not do a differential privacy, but maybe let's try something else. Maybe let's do like some kind of data set sanitization, where like I'll like search out for these one documents that like have all of these weird things. Because like here's one document. If I remove this one document, and like I mean, each of these are a different document, but like if I removed one document in each of these cases, I could get rid of a bunch of memorization. And so like maybe I should be like curating my documents better, so that like I can like be more careful with what I sort of allow my model to learn on. And this is sort of this would be good, but empirically, training on more diverse data sets is good for these models. It's good for the models just to give better in-distribution accuracy, but it gives them also really good out-of-distribution accuracy. And training on these kinds of just like uncurated data has recently shown to give all sorts of nice fairness and bias and robustness things in some settings, where like if I removed all of the tails of the distribution, I'm only going to learn the things that are like most common, and I'm going to learn nothing about anything that's uncommon. And so like you want to keep the tails of the distribution in, so that you don't like sort of artificially bias the model into only knowing about the things that most people talk about on the internet. I'd like it to know about sort of other things that people tend to talk about, which are not only sort of the most common things. And so, yeah, you have to be very careful with how you try and like, you could try and solve the fairness problem, and you might make privacy worse. You might try and solve the privacy problem and make fairness worse. And I don't know exactly how this relationship would hold, but you have to be careful. So it's not something that we have good answers for right now. So this is standardization where we might like try and remove sort of documents entirely, or you could try and do this thing that we were just mentioning briefly of deduplication, or again like same table. Here we have like individual strings that are occurring 311 times. That's a random memorized string, where like, clearly like you would like to be able to tell me like just find all duplicated strings and just remove them. But again, like, at what level do you do this? When is like if you report, like if you have some common person's name, like it's probably fine for the model to know some common person's name. But like this random sequence of 40 characters that was inserted 311 times, that probably should not be in the training data that many times. And so like it's very hard to write down a precise rule for exactly what you want to happen here. Yeah. Okay. So this is sort of the end of the talk. I guess the basic conclusion is, I guess two of them I think are most interesting. The first is that large language models actually do memorize their trained data sets, and we are able to extract it. And this is true sort of for the best model that you could ever hope to have trained at the time, which was GPT-2. We've done this analysis since on T5. T5 does memorize its training data also. GPT-3, when it first came out, released a couple thousand examples of like of example output of what the model looked like. And I sort of manually analyzed just like maybe 100 of their like just example outputs and found one of them was already memorized just from the internet. And so GPT-3 I know does this too. To what extent these models do and why they do and all these sorts of other researchy questions, I don't think we have great answers for lots of them. But now that sort of we can say emphatically that these large models actually do, this is a real problem, I think it's interesting to study this because this is one of these cases where things are not going to get better over time. Some problems just go away if you sort of wait long enough. Some problems get worse. This seems like one of the ones that's going to get worse. And I would really like to understand this memorization phenomenon before it becomes like serious. And hopefully, if more of us do this, we'll be able to do this. So I think I have a couple minutes now to take questions at the end. I think we'll turn the recording off. And then if you have any questions after that, please feel free to email me and I'd be happy to try and answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicolas.